The air in the small spacecraft was dank and heavy, the musty odor of unwashed bodies and stale sweat permeating every nook and cranny. Condensation beaded on the metallic walls, catching and reflecting the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling. Commander Grayson's voice grated like gravel. He sat at the center of the circular space, his back against the hull, his eyes searching the faces of his crew as he spoke. "We've got a bloody problem." His words were met with silence. They all knew what he meant. It had been 2 weeks since the Stargazer had been forced off course, pulled like a rag doll into the gravity well of some godforsaken planet. 2 weeks without respite from the constant barrage of asteroid impacts against their hull, the creaking and groaning as the pressure outside threatened to implode the ship. Their rations were on the verge of depletion, too, and the constant, inescapable clawing need for more oxygen. The life-sustaining air had become so thin that their lungs burned with every ragged breath. "What do you propose we do, sir?" Morana asked, her voice calm and composed, despite her haunted eyes. "We're running out of time, and we're running out of options," Grayson replied. His voice, though weary, rang with authority. "We have to do what's necessary. You all know what I'm talking about." There was a long pause before Rune looked up, his dark eyes glinting with steely determination. "Fine. Let's get on with it, then." Grayson nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Morana, you and Rune suit up. We'll need to venture outside the ship." The 2 crew members exchanged a glance before Morana spoke up. "Commander, with all due respect, we don't have enough suits for everyone. And even if we did, the conditions outside are lethal." Grayson's eyes narrowed as he considered her words. "I know it's risky, but we have no other choice." He turned to the rest of the crew who had been listening in silence. "The rest of you will stay here and continue trying to repair the communication system so we can send out a distress signal." There were murmurs of agreement as Morana and Rune made their way to the airlock. The pressure equalized with a hiss as they opened it and stepped out into the void. Rune led the way towards an asteroid that had collided with their ship earlier in their journey. They carefully made their way across its surface until they reached a small opening. "Here," Rune said, pointing at what looked like a fissure in the rock. Morana peered into the darkness of the fissure, her heart pounding in her chest. The beam of her flashlight barely penetrated the blackness beyond. She hesitated for a moment before glancing back at Rune. He nodded once, his jaw set in determination. Together, they crawled through the narrow opening and into what appeared to be a small cavern. The air was thick with dust and debris, and Morana coughed as she shone her light around the space. "Anything?" she asked, scanning for any sign of what they had come for. Rune shook his head. "Not yet." They searched every inch of the cavern until finally, Morana's light caught on something glittering in the corner. It was exactly what they needed, a rare mineral that could power their ship's engines long enough to get them out of this godforsaken system. Morana's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the glittering mineral, her gloved hand trembling ever so slightly. She called Rune over, her voice a sharp whisper in the hollow darkness. "We found it," she muttered, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and hope. Rune hurried over, his breathing shallow in the suit. His gloved fingers traced the edges of the mineral as if unsure it was real. "It's enough," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We can power the ship." Morana exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Back on the ship, the atmosphere was equally tense. Commander Grayson paced in circles around the dimly lit control room, his fingers running over the stubble on his chin. "What's taking so long?" he muttered under his breath. The rest of the crew worked silently on the malfunctioning communication system, the faint hum of broken circuits their only company. "They'll make it back," one of the younger crew members, Cadet Lee, said softly, trying to reassure himself more than anyone else. Grayson shot him a glance but said nothing. Morana and Rune emerged from the asteroid's fissure, the weight of their discovery heavy on their minds. The return trip to the ship felt longer, every step across the jagged asteroid surface reminding them of the thin line they walked between life and death. Just one wrong step, Rune thought as his boot hovered over a sharp ledge. They couldn't afford any more accidents. As they approached the ship's airlock, a deep, resounding creak echoed through the void. "What the hell was that?" Morana asked, eyes scanning the black horizon. The ship shuddered again, this time more violently. Inside, Grayson and the others stumbled, grasping onto the metal frames of their workstations for balance. "We've got another impact," shouted Juno, one of the engineers, her voice laced with panic. Grayson clenched his jaw. The ship's hull was already paper-thin from weeks of asteroid bombardment. One more significant hit and they might not survive the next breach. "Keep working on the comms," he ordered. "If we don't get that signal out, we're dead anyway." As Morana and Rune secured the mineral in the ship's containment unit, the airlock hissed shut behind them. The ship groaned ominously again, but they paid it no mind. They had what they needed. "Commander," Rune said into his communicator, "we're back and we've got the power source." Relief washed over Grayson's face, but only for a second. "Good. But we're not out of the woods yet. Get that thing installed and fast." Time was running out and Grayson knew it. The engine room was a mess of exposed wires, burnt-out panels, and leaking coolant. Morana and Rune worked side by side, their hands moving with purpose. As they connected the rare mineral to the ship's power core, a soft hum filled the air. "It's working," Rune said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. Morana wiped sweat from her brow. "Let's just hope it holds long enough to get us out of this system." Outside, the asteroid storm intensified, each impact against the ship a reminder of their precarious situation. Just as the ship's engines began to hum with renewed life, a red light flashed on the control panel. "No, no, no," Juno muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We've got a breach in the lower decks. The pressure's dropping fast." Grayson's stomach sank. They couldn't afford to lose any more oxygen. "Seal it off," he barked, his voice tight. "We'll deal with the rest later." But the breach was spreading faster than anyone anticipated. "Commander," Morana's voice crackled through the intercom, "we need to get out of here now." Grayson didn't need to be told twice. "All hands, prepare for immediate departure." The crew scrambled, sealing off compartments, powering up systems, and bracing for the jolt of the ship breaking free from the planet's gravity well. The engines roared to life, and for a brief moment, hope surged through the crew. But that hope was short-lived. As the ship ascended, another asteroid struck, this time with devastating force. The ship lurched violently, and alarms blared through every corner of the vessel. "We've lost navigation," shouted Juno. The asteroid had damaged their thrusters, and now the ship was spinning uncontrollably in space. Panic rippled through the crew. "Stabilizers are offline," Grayson muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of his seat. "We're dead in the water." Morana and Rune were thrown against the walls of the engine room as the ship spun out of control. "We need to fix the stabilizers," Morana shouted over the alarms, her voice strained. Rune nodded, pulling himself to his feet. The ship's systems were failing, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating, making every movement a challenge. They stumbled toward the control panel, their vision blurring from the strain. Just as they reached the stabilizer controls, the ship jerked again, this time knocking them both to the ground. Morana gasped as her head hit the cold, hard floor. "Rune!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Rune groaned in response, struggling to pull himself up. Blood trickled down his forehead, but there was no time to assess the damage. The ship was on the verge of tearing itself apart. Outside the ship, the asteroid storm raged on, pelting the hull with unrelenting force. The stars above were distant, cold witnesses to the crew's desperate plight. The planet they had been trapped near seemed to mock them, its gravity still pulling at their vessel like a predator unwilling to let go of its prey. Grayson clenched his fists, staring out into the void. "We're not going down like this," he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, in the engine room, Morana and Rune were making progress. With a few frantic adjustments, they managed to bring the stabilizers back online. The ship stopped spinning, but their relief was short-lived. "We've lost main thrusters," Rune said, his voice grim. "We're running on fumes here." Morana glanced at him, her face pale but determined. "We're not giving up. We just need to make it to the next system. That's all." Back in the control room, Grayson watched as the ship's systems flickered, threatening to go dark at any moment. "Juno, give me something," he growled, his voice tense. Juno's hands flew across the controls, her face illuminated by the red emergency lights. "I'm trying, Commander, but this ship is falling apart faster than we can fix it." Grayson knew she was right, but he refused to admit defeat. "Not yet. We've got another asteroid incoming," Lee shouted, his eyes wide with fear. Grayson's heart raced. They couldn't take another hit. "Brace for impact," he ordered, gripping the armrests of his chair. The asteroid struck with a deafening crash, sending shockwaves through the ship. Metal groaned, and sparks flew from the control panels. The lights flickered, plunging the crew into momentary darkness. In the engine room, Morana and Rune were thrown off their feet once more. The sound of tearing metal echoed around them, and for a brief moment, Morana thought the ship was breaking apart. But as the lights flickered back on, they realized they were still in one piece. "Barely. We can't take much more of this," Rune said, his voice strained. Morana nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll make it. We have to." Grayson's mind raced as the ship systems failed around him. They were running out of time, out of options, and out of luck. He glanced at the cracked window, the stars outside shimmering faintly. "We're so close," he muttered. "We just need one break. Just one." But the universe seemed determined to deny them that break. Morana's hands flew across the engine controls, her mind working frantically to keep the ship running. Every system was failing, and it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic happened. But she refused to let that stop her. "We're not done yet," she whispered to herself, her fingers dancing over the control panel. "Not yet." As the ship limped through the asteroid field, battered and bruised, Grayson's eyes flicked to the navigation screen. The next system was close. So close. If they could just hold out a little longer, they might make it. "We're almost there," he said aloud, as much to himself as to the crew. Just a little longer. But just as hope began to rise within the crew, the ship's alarms blared once more. "What now?" Grayson shouted, his voice hoarse. Juno's face turned pale as she read the readings. "There's something else out there," she whispered. "Something big." Before Grayson could respond, the ship was rocked by a force unlike any they had encountered before. This was no asteroid. This was something far worse. The ship's sudden jolt was like nothing they had ever experienced. The crew was thrown about like ragdolls, each bracing for impact that never came. "What was that?" Morana whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the now quiet control panel. Rune checked the exterior cameras, his heart pounding. "Commander, you need to see this," he said, his voice trembling. On the screen, the dark void of space had opened, revealing an enormous, hulking shadow that loomed over their tiny ship. It wasn't an asteroid. It wasn't even a planet. It was a massive alien structure, ancient and dormant, but undeniably alive. Grayson's mouth went dry as he took in the sight. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, but no one had an answer. The crew was frozen in place, staring at the alien structure. It dwarfed their ship, its smooth metallic surface glowing faintly with an eerie light. As they watched, a part of the structure began to shift, as if waking from a deep slumber. "It's opening," Juno whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. A massive doorway appeared, leading into the dark interior. Grayson's mind raced, torn between curiosity and survival instinct. "We can't go in there," Lee stammered, his face pale. "We don't know what's inside." But Grayson's curiosity had been piqued. They had nowhere else to go, and the ship wouldn't last much longer in its current state. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice firm. "We're going in." The ship inched closer to the alien structure, its sensors scanning the massive doorway. Morana and Rune exchanged a nervous glance as they prepared for what lay ahead. "This feels wrong," Rune muttered, gripping the console in front of him. But Morana's resolve was unshaken. "We've come this far. Whatever's in there, it can't be worse than what we've already faced." As the ship passed through the threshold, the alien structure seemed to come alive around them. Lights flickered on, illuminating the dark corridors ahead. The walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. "I don't like this," Juno said, her voice trembling. Grayson remained silent, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Something about this place felt familiar. The deeper they ventured into the structure, the more unsettling it became. The air inside was thick and heavy, like the atmosphere of the dying planet they had left behind. But this wasn't just a ruin. It was something far more ancient and intelligent. "Commander," Morana said softly, "I think this place, it was waiting for us." Grayson's brow furrowed as her words sank in. The thought made his skin crawl, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. "We need to find the control center," he said, his voice tense. "There's got to be a way to communicate with whatever's here. Maybe it can help us." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no turning back now. As they ventured deeper into the structure, the symbols on the walls grew more complex, their glow pulsating rhythmically. "I think it's guiding us," Rune said, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "But to what?" Morana asked, her voice barely a whisper. The crew's unease was palpable, but they pressed on, the strange pull of the structure drawing them ever closer to the unknown. Finally, they reached a massive chamber, its walls lined with ancient consoles and machinery. In the center of the room stood a single figure, tall, metallic, and unmoving. It was humanoid in shape, but clearly not of this world. "Is that alive?" Juno asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grayson stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding. The figure's eyes flickered to life, glowing with the same eerie light as the symbols on the walls. The figure's voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant. "You have come," it said, its tone neither hostile nor welcoming. "You have awakened the drift." Grayson's blood ran cold. "What is the drift?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The figure remained silent for a moment, its glowing eyes fixed on the crew. "The drift is all," it finally said. It is everywhere and it is nowhere. And now you are part of it. The crew stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Grayson took a step forward, his mind racing. "We need your help," he said, his voice strained. "Our ship is damaged. We need to get back to our home system." The figure's eyes flickered again, as if considering his words. "Help? You do not understand. The drift is not a place to leave. It is where all come to stay." Morana's heart pounded as the figure's words sank in. "We're trapped here," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Rune clenched his fists, his eyes darting around the room. "There has to be a way out," he muttered. But the figure's glowing eyes seemed to say otherwise. They had ventured too far, and now the drift had claimed them. As the figure moved closer, Grayson felt a strange sensation wash over him. A sense of peace, as if the struggle no longer mattered. The crew felt it too, their fear and desperation fading away. "It is time," the figure said softly. "Time to become part of the drift." Grayson's eyes fluttered closed, the weight of the universe lifting from his shoulders. But just as the crew was about to surrender to the drift's embrace, Morana's eyes snapped open. Something wasn't right. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "This isn't the end. Not for us." She lunged toward the console, her fingers flying across the ancient controls. The figure's eyes flared with anger, but it was too late. Morana had activated something, a failsafe. The entire structure began to shake, the walls crumbling as the drift's grip weakened. "What did you do?" Rune shouted, his voice filled with both fear and awe. Morana didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the crumbling walls around them. "We're getting out of here," she said, her voice steady. "One way or another." The figure's voice boomed through the chamber, filled with fury. "You cannot escape the drift. You are bound to it." But Morana refused to listen. She slammed her hand down on the final control, and the structure began to collapse in on itself. The crew raced toward their ship, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the ship, the alien structure imploded behind them, its once majestic form now nothing more than debris. The crew scrambled inside, sealing the airlock behind them. "Engines are online," Rune shouted, his hands flying over the controls. "We're getting out of here." The ship roared to life, breaking free from the drift's pull. As the ship hurtled through space, leaving the ruins of the drift behind, Morana slumped into her seat, her heart still racing. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But as the crew began to relax, a soft, eerie hum filled the air. Grayson's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tense. The ship's lights flickered, and the crew's faces paled as they realized the truth. The drift wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, and it had followed them. The hum grew louder, filling the ship with its presence. "We're not out yet," Morana whispered, her voice filled with dread. "The drift. It's coming for us." As the crew braced for the worst, the ship's systems suddenly flickered back to life, the drift's presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "What just happened?" Rune asked, his voice trembling. Morana shook her head, confusion etched on her face. I don't know," she stammered. But something deep inside her told her the drift hadn't let them go. "Not really." Grayson's hands shook as he checked the ship's sensors. "We're clear," he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "The drift is gone." But the unease in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. They had escaped its physical form, but the drift's influence still lingered, a shadow that would follow them wherever they went. The crew sat in stunned silence, their hearts still racing from the narrow escape. "It's over," Juno whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. But Grayson wasn't so sure. The drift had claimed countless others before them, and it would continue to do so long after they were gone. "We need to stay vigilant," he said softly. "This isn't over." As the ship soared through the vast expanse of space, Morana couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The drift had let them go, but for how long? "We need to find out what that thing really was," she said, her voice firm. "Before it finds us again." Grayson nodded, his face grim. They had escaped once, but they might not be so lucky next time. The crew's relief was short-lived as the drift's eerie hum echoed in their minds, a reminder that it was never truly gone. They had escaped its grasp for now, but the drift had marked them. "We'll never be free," Grayson whispered, his voice filled with a resigned fear. "The drift is part of us now. But tell me, did you like this story? Would you change anything? Would you like a sequel? Leave it in the comments, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and leave your like. And for more stories like this, click on the video that appears on the screen.